could ask everyone to take their seats again. Mr. Rankin has a motion. Mr. Rankin.
Well, thank you, Chair. And my motion's simple. I have three reasons in justification for it I'd also like to make. But first of all, the motion I'll read goes like this, that the Justice Committee recall the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould to testify at her earliest convenience. I have three reasons in support of that, Mr. Chair. First of all, that the Liberals voted down our efforts to obtain access to relevant emails and documents earlier today. The second reason is because she interpreted, correctly or incorrectly, the order in council allowing her to testify to not allow her to testify to events after her removal as Attorney General on January 14th, 2018. And the third and perhaps most important reason for my motion to recall her is that there's a stark contradiction in testimony that all Canadians can appreciate today. It was said that facts are stubborn things. Well, for the record, I believe Jody Wilson-Raybould, and I think we do need to get to the bottom of this for Canadians. So for those three reasons, I think it's imperative that we go on the record now and invite her back at her earliest convenience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. Colleagues, who else wishes to speak to this? Mr. Fraser? Mr. Ray? Yep.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate what Mr. Rankin is saying as usual. However, a couple of points. First of all, when Ms. Wilson-Raybould was before our committee, I note that an invitation to table the documents she was referencing specifically in her testimony was asked to be tabled, and she said she would take that under advisement. I'm referring to the fact that that's what Ms. Wilson-Raybould had indicated to us at committee at that time. About documents that she had referenced in her testimony. With regard to additional witnesses, there will be witnesses this afternoon, obviously, whose testimony will be important in order to hear what they have to say. And we have, in the motion for today's meeting, established that the following meeting, the next meeting we have as a committee, will be to discuss next steps and to determine the following procedures for our committee, and I believe it would be appropriate to do it in that fashion and hear from the witnesses this afternoon, and then meet again in order to reflect on all the testimony and then discuss next steps. So I won't be supporting the motion.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper and then Ms. Wright.
Ms. Wright can go.
Ms. Wright?
Yeah.
Ms. Wright?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to support the motion, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm very troubled by Mr. Butts' testimony in response to questions about whether or not PMO staff had taken actions that Jody Wilson-Raybould had indicated to us that they had taken. His blanket denial, and not a denial, he said, I can't imagine any of the players, Mr. Marquez or Mr. Bouchard or the clerk, Mr. Wernick, would do these things. I find highly improbable. If that is the case, then what he is saying is that Jody Wilson-Raybould did not tell this committee the truth, and she needs to be cross-examined on that fact. If the testimony of this witness is that that is incorrect, then we need to bring her back and ensure that we have the right facts for Canadian public. Because at this point, we don't. We have two opposing stories that's dependent upon the credibility, and I'm going to keep my mind open. And I'd like to hear back from her, because this witness was very clear that he couldn't imagine, given the character of the individuals, that they would ever do the actions, serious actions, that Jody Wilson-Raybould has accused them of.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would really just reiterate the point that in light of Mr. Butts' testimony on several points, there is a direct contradiction with testimony of Ms. Wilson-Raybould. And I have to say that I was a little bit struck that in some instances Mr. Butts had a very detailed recollection of events, and then on other matters he seemed to be rather fuzzy. It seemed to me to be a little bit selective, but it seems to me to be nearly impossible that Mr. Butts could not recall the fact that, according to Jody Wilson-Raybould, on December 5th, she said, quote, towards the end of our meeting, which was in the Chateau Laurier, I raised how I needed everybody to stop talking to me about SNC as I made up my mind and the engagements were inappropriate, unquote. Mr. Butts said that he was briefed by, he couldn't recall if it was the Prime Minister or the Clerk of the Privy Council, but in any event, he was briefed on after the September 17th meeting, in which Jody Wilson-Raybould testified before our committee, quote, "I was quite taken aback. My response, and I vividly remember this as well, was to ask the Prime Minister a direct question while looking him in the eye. I asked, are you politically interfering with my role, my decision as Attorney General? I would strongly advise against it," unquote. Again, it's a little bit difficult to imagine that if that in fact had happened, that Mr. Butts wouldn't have been brought, that issue would not have been brought to Mr. Butts's attention. So I think out of fairness and in the name of getting to the truth, whatever that truth is, I think it is absolutely essential that Ms. Wilson-Raybould be able to come back and address those issues and be cross-examined, as well as to speak to the matters that she clearly and repeatedly has said are relevant, namely during the time that she was removed as the Attorney General but remained as the Minister of Veterans Affairs, including communications that she had leading up to her being removed, the communications that she had immediately following her removal, and her presentation to Cabinet following her resignation from Cabinet.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rankin?
Yeah, just to, I want to say to Mr. Fraser in particular, I appreciate the intervention. The purpose of our usual rule to deal with witnesses in camera is because we don't want Canadians to see who we've chosen, A over B, that could be embarrassing and so forth. That's the purpose, I understand, for our usual practice. There's no such purpose required to be met here. Here we have a situation where Canadians had 4.5 hours of testimony from someone, and we simply want her to come back. So I see no impropriety in having us make a decision today in those circumstances. So I would ask that the motion be voted upon.
Absolutely. I just want to make sure that there's nobody else that wants to speak. Sure. Ms. May? Committee, do we have do we agree that Ms. May can speak?
I would
Okay.
just say this, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the latitude from my colleagues around the table. If I were able to vote on this, I would ask that Jody Wilson-Raybould come back to respond to the evidence from Mr. Butts.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. So we'll have a vote on the motion from Mr. Rankin. So Mr. Clerk.
Monsieur Boissonneau? No. Mr. Isasi? Mr. Isasi?
No.
Mr. Fraser? Ms. Khalid?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Barrett?
Yes, in the interest of justice.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Ms. Raitt?
Yes.
And Mr. Rankin?
Yes.
Yeas pour, 4-4, nays contre, 5-5.
Okay, so the motion is defeated. Colleagues, I would remind everybody that we have another meeting at 2 o'clock, which I'm sure many of you have to prepare
Point of
for.
order.
Oh, sorry. Ms. Raitt?
Mr. Chair, I'm just curious. Can you remind me how it is that the clerk, the Privy Council, and the Deputy Minister of Justice are coming back to refute Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony for a second time? However, did they ask us for it? Did we vote on? Can you remind us exactly how they ended up on the afternoon schedule as a second go-around? Because it would be great context for Canadians to understand exactly why Jody Wilson-Raybould isn't allowed to come back.
Certainly, Ms. Raitt, I'd be happy to. There was a motion to the committee that said following the testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould, the committee would meet to consider next steps. At a meeting of the committee that followed that, the committee agreed to call Mr. Wernick, Ms. Drouin, and Mr. Butts to come testify. And as part of that same motion, they said that after those testimonies were over, they would meet to consider next steps. And that's where we are now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Raitt. So colleagues, I'll see you all at 2 o'clock. Meeting adjourned.